From Cambridge University Press, in collaboration with The Naked Scientists, this is episode 6 of the Cambridge Prisms podcast, addressing real-world challenges in research and discovery. I'm Chris Smith. And this month, the plastic problem. 350 million tonnes of the stuff get produced every year, and it's everywhere. So why aren't people shouting about it? Or are they? Can we put a price on extinction? We look at the economic costs of species loss and conservation. And what about water? Is there a sensible business model for countries to follow as populations grow and climate change kicks in? But first this month, inside each of us is a thriving family of microbes that outnumber our own 37 trillion human cells at least twofold. Together, they weigh in at over a kilo, and some scientists now regard this microbiome, as it's known, as an organ in its own right and one of our greatest medical oversights, dismissed for decades as mere colonising microbes. But in recent years, we've begun to realise that the suite of thousands of biochemicals released by these bacteria and fungi, and the metabolic knives and forks that they bring to our digestive systems, are crucial to health and disease, determining even our blood pressure, as the University of Toledo's Bina Zhou explains.
We're working on the microbiome, and we are looking at how this microbiome influences blood pressure, hypertension, which is a number one risk factor for cardiovascular diseases. And our lab was the first to discover that the tiny bugs that live in our guts actually tweak our blood pressure.
What's the evidence for that association? Before we think about how they might be doing that, what's the pure evidence that they are even doing that?
I will go back to my first publication where we did this experiment. We took a rat with normal blood pressure and asked if its microbiome is perfect, and can we then take its slurry of bugs in its gut and add it to animals that have high blood pressure. But to our astonishment, what happened was it did not lower blood pressure, but it further increased its hypertension, which was the first piece of evidence that these bugs are doing something to the blood pressure of these animals.
Is there wider evidence that this is not just a laboratory phenomenon, though? If we look in humans, can we see signs that what lives in us may be influencing our blood pressure?
Absolutely. So following our animal experiments, human geneticists started exploring this idea and find associations of gut microbiota, which is the bugs in our bodies, with people's blood pressures. So there are considerable studies now showing this as conclusive association in humans. The point of association is difficult to prove causation, and therefore we go back to the animals and then show that when there are animals which don't have any bugs in them, and then you introduce germs into them, blood pressure increased. So that was the causative evidence that we went after for what is the next mechanism question, right?
Indeed. So if something causes something to happen, there must be a plausible biochemical mechanism. So what do you think they might be doing that would manipulate the blood pressure in a host animal?
That's $1 million question. I wish I could answer that. These microbes generate thousands of biochemicals, and they secrete them into our bodies. So we are looking into which one of these chemicals that they make affect our blood pressure. We don't have answers yet. We have a few indications of some metabolites, but not all of them. And that's where the research space is currently.
Over the years, when we've learned then that diet has a really important role to play in cardiovascular disease, do you think a contribution of our diet is that the microbes digest our dinner and they make biomolecules which then in turn affect our disease risk?
Absolutely. That was how we started this research. Think of salt. It's the number one dietary factor that increases blood pressure, and salt is used for ages to make pickles. So salt kills bacteria. Think of consuming salt and that rearranging the population of the bugs in your body. That's exactly what it does. And that's where it got fascinating for beyond diet. What else are we eating to kill bacteria? Classic example, antibiotics. Are we consuming antibiotics and changing our physiology? Yes, we do. In our animal models, 3 different antibiotics that we tried actually raised blood pressure in our animals, and that's alarming. We further went and asked, is it all the antibiotics or only some? We tried amoxicillin because it's used in children so often. And at least in our animal model, amoxicillin was the only one that did not increase blood pressure. So we are saying that might be the safe one, but other antibiotics did raise blood pressure. Then you can expand it to what are the environmental agents. There are so many herbicides, weedicides that we use. They are to kill plants, but they also kill microbes. So are we exposed to agents that destroy our microbiome? The answer is yes.
And to what extent might these effects be permanent? Because we use a lot of antibiotics and we
Yeah.
almost certainly are demolishing people's microbiomes for a while when we do that. Does that leave holes in the microbiome when it comes back, which are going to set people up to develop some of these conditions? Or do they fill in those holes and reacquire the missing microbes again? So antibiotics are a short-term curse, but it's only a major problem if you're on them for a long time.
I'll refer you to a paper that came out in Nature a few years back where they compared paleofeces, which is 7,000-year-old poop samples, and compared the microbiome in that sample to modern day industrialized world with some European countries represented and with underdeveloped nations and developing nations microbiomes of humans. And they found that the ancient microbiome aligned with the underdeveloped and developing nations' microbiomes better, which means clearly that the industrialized nation, which there is maximum exposure to all the environmental agents that I was talking about, including antibiotic usage, we have probably changed our microbiome drastically.
Do you foresee then a time coming where, when we assess a patient, rather than just give them another antihypertensive to try, we will be looking at their microbiome and asking, what can I add or what can I subtract microbe wise, through probably giving different foodstuffs to manipulate the microbiome, and that will have as much efficacy as some of the pills we give people?
Absolutely, Chris. I'm a believer in this. For hypertension, we have been focused on genetics for too long to look at genes in our bodies that are different variations of which are associated with human hypertensives, right? But that's only 30% that can explain the incidence of hypertension. So, what is this other 70%? We have been looking at the environment and we bring in microbiome as a new, less appreciated in the past discovery piece for to look at. What I'm trying to say is it's not just treatment with pills. Another thing we have done is we have inserted an antihypertensive gene called ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2, to bacteria, lactobacilli, and gave it as a probiotic to our animals, and it's able to lower blood pressure. So there are opportunities for manipulating microbiota and using them as pills, if you may want to, before you develop hypertension.
It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Being a Joe there. Each year, the world produces about 350 million tonnes of plastic. In total, we've made about 8.3 billion tonnes since plastic was first invented. That's 1 tonne for roughly every one of us alive today. And although some is recycled, there are limits, and most of it still ends up in landfill, the wider environment, and the oceans, where the health impacts are only just beginning to become apparent. But what do members of the public think about plastic pollution, and does public sentiment have any leverage to address the problem? Inspired by a recent session he chaired at a conference on this topic, these are some of the issues that Tony Walker, who's at Dalhousie University in Canada, has been exploring.
In terms of the public's ability to do anything about it, many members and results really from this study, a lot of people feel powerless because it's corporations and governments and consumerism. We're part of the problem. We like convenience. Producers are producing this stuff. We don't really have the decision-making powers in order to curb that. Governments do. Next week, coincidentally, the 4th Intergovernmental Panel Negotiating Committee meets in Ottawa to come together to develop a legally binding plastics treaty. So governments are aware of this now, but it seems public opinion and public perception has been on the increase since around 2015.
What has driven the massive explosion in all of this consumption, though? Because I just looked at my shopping that I did last week, and to be perfectly frank, after I'd cooked an evening meal, the bin was overflowing. And I don't eat loads of ready meals and that kind of thing. I was cooking reasonable food, but it's all coming almost obligatorily in huge amounts of plastic, and you end up throwing equivalent volume to what you bought in the bin.
That's absolutely right. And even with your best efforts, it's really hard to avoid plastic and plastic packaging. And the material you're talking about is exactly the kind of things we were asking our general public across these different countries. And it relates to single-use plastic packaging, essentially the stuff that we can find alternatives for, and in many cases, things we can do without and avoid. But in fact, we can't avoid them because manufacturers, grocers, retailers, they stock their products in these items on the shelf, and it's really difficult to avoid, even with the best intentions, like you mentioned.
What's the way to predate this then?
So we have seen a change in marketing and production, especially a 20-fold increase in plastic production since around the 1950s. And much of that has been driven by convenience and plastic packaging, the sort of, food packaging we're talking about. That's grown, and we've become to rely on it as convenience. But where we can change is introducing sustainable alternatives. And I would add a word of caution there, because there's no need to switch from one single-use item to another single-use item, because everything really has an environmental footprint. But to move towards reuse systems, so reusable bags and reusable packaging, or even dispense with packaging altogether. Instead of, for example, bananas wrapped in plastic bags, why not just have the bananas in bunches and just weigh them? They're perfectly packaged in their own skins.
I was going to make that point, which is not about the bananas, but about bags, because about 20 years ago, supermarket shopping bags, plastic bags that were just given out with abandon whenever you did your shopping, this became a focal point of public disquiet. And a strong campaign was mounted, wasn't it? And we saw supermarkets introduce pricing and charging for those things. There was a shift towards using bags for life, let's say. It seems, though, that we've been very virtuous on that front, but then supermarkets have instead insisted on force-feeding us all our shopping now, wrapped up in the plastic. So even though the bags aren't being sold or given away at the checkout, everything else is still plastic wrapped. It's almost like we've robbed Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah, and again, that's a great marketing ploy behind the scenes with the kind of oil and gas companies, the petroleum companies, because 99% of all plastics, consumer plastics, are derived from fossil fuels feedstocks. And of course, with countries and consumers switching to fuel efficient cars and fuel efficient homes, there is a shift now and a push to market petroleum products in the form of single-use plastics. And so here we are, everything is wrapped in some form of plastic. And what makes it incredibly difficult to recycle at the end of life, you mentioned your bin overflowing, most of that is landfilled, and very little of it is recycled because it's complex, it contains different colored plastics, different chemicals, and indeed, in many cases, different types of plastic. So they can't be recycled because they're already mixed. So it is a very complex issue, and it's something which has been forced upon consumers really by producers and retailers.
We've talked on this programme before about the health impacts of some forms of plastic. People are very worried about their health, more so than the health of the planet even. So do you think that might be one way to get at this, to say to people, look, this isn't great for the health of the planet, but it may also have consequences for human health in certain circumstances. Let's try and avoid it. Let's motivate retailers not to do this.
Exactly. And in fact, that's something that 8 billion people have now recognized, and they've had their own eureka moment, if you will. because they're recognizing it's not just impacting fish and wildlife that they've seen entangled or ingesting plastic. I mean, that's bad enough, and that raises public awareness in and of itself. But when it really affects people and affects your families, then of course the penny drops. And in fact, there was your listeners may or may not be aware, but there was a report released in March, and it documented at least 16,000 chemicals, different chemicals that are used in plastic manufacture across the entire, various plastics, of which 25% of those are known to be toxic and harmful. And so none of this information is really disclosed by producers and many manufacturers of food products wouldn't know what the packaging's made of, but the plastic producers do, but it's not released to the general public. And so I think it's important to recognize that whilst we don't know the name of every single unpronounceable chemical compound in those plastics, 25% of them are known to be harmful. And I think we really do need to do something about that.
Tony Walker on the burgeoning problem of plastic. This is the Cambridge Prisms podcast, and I'm Chris Smith. In a minute, blue carbon, that's the sponge in the sea that soaks up our greenhouse gas emissions. But first, when we think about a species going extinct, invariably our minds jump to overexploitation or poaching, environmental destruction and habitat loss, and also climate change. But only rarely do we think about the economics of species loss, which is what Ian Fraser at the University of Kent has been urging us to do, translating the mechanisms of extinction, conservation and species preservation into economic terms can, he thinks, help researchers and policymakers to understand why species disappear and what needs to be done to reverse the losses that we're currently experiencing. Correctly valuing species within the wider economy, he says, is key to reversing many of the pressures that cause their decline.
Fundamentally, the biggest problem we face as a society is we've got many competing wants and we've got limited resources. And so we've got to make some hard choices about what we want to spend scarce resources on. So every pound we spend on, say, schools or universities or hospitals, that's a pound we can't spend on something else. And so when it comes to species conservation and basically thinking about species extinction, we have got a limited budget. So we do have to think very carefully about how we allocate the scarce resource in such a way that we try to make the most of what we currently have. Some of the basic economics of species extinction tells you that if we don't set up our institutions and our, if you like, the context in which economic activity is undertaken in, we can very quickly, give individuals, producers, an incentive to overharvest. And by overharvesting, say like fish, we can effectively drive a particular species to extinction. So even if we can understand that they're valuable and we would like to keep them, we sometimes just get it very, very wrong.
It's also not quite straightforward in the sense that you gave an example. If a fish is something we want and we take too much of it, we can drive it to extinction. On the other hand, if there's an environment that the fish lives in and we want something from that environment that the fish also wants, and we take the thing away from the fish will also go extinct, but not because we want it. So it's more complicated than just supply and demand.
Yeah, absolutely. So driving something to extinction, is quite difficult. So, there are examples of introduced species. For example, in New Zealand, they have lots of possums, which they don't want because they have a detrimental effect on that particular environment. Actually harvesting something to extinction is actually quite a difficult thing to do. So it does tend to be, if we, however, then make a mess of the environment or we reduce the environment that can support these species, that's probably, along with our inappropriate management in terms of harvesting, that's going to do it. So yeah, the things do happen in tandem. And very often it is often the loss of, if you like, the appropriate sort of supporting environment that really will be the deep down core reason why we see extinction, as opposed to us really trying to drive something to extinction by inappropriate harvesting.
And is the purpose of your argument that you can arm people who are like policymakers or lobbyists trying to influence policymakers with some tools that will enable them to translate the message, the environmental message, into a financial/economical message, which is often something that policymakers are going to understand and engage with better?
To a certain extent, yes, we can try to, if you like, place value, I think, which is what you're really getting at here, on the particular species, The species themselves may have value as we would see it as economists in and of themselves, but also they would have value to us. If we can demonstrate value in the myriad of ways in which we can think about value, because there is value as we see it as economists, but there are other groups, other researchers, other academics will view value in other ways. But if we can demonstrate value, we can make people sort of conscious of that in their decision making, the hope is they make better decisions. It's when typically we really undervalue something or the value of something is not fully appreciated that we tend to make these, if you like, these mistakes in terms of the way we manage species.
And what about when we go too far? We come to the party too late in our realisation. Oh dear, we have gone too far. Now we're going to try and de-extinctify. I don't know if I had a neologism there, but you understand what I'm getting at. We try to reverse what's occurring. Is that something that could be factored in as well? There must be an economic aspect to that.
Yeah, there is. We do have, you can think about that in terms of, so within the sort of the way of thinking about trying to recreate a population, or trying to, if you like, sort of widen the gene pool of an existing population of a very small number of particular, say, animals within a particular species type. We will find examples of what you might call translocation. So I've done bits of work with people at the university where we were looking at translocating a bird species onto a second island in the Seychelles because the particular bird species in question was only on one island. And so in an attempt to increase the population, to give it more, if you like, sort of hopefully more resilience going forward, by creating a second population and increasing the numbers, we will hopefully then be able to, if you like, reverse the possibility of extinction occurring. And you can put economics into the analysis of that. You can think about the cost of creating the environment. You can think about the cost of actually moving species. You can also think about the risks involved in trying to move species. That, you can't just simply pick something up and move it somewhere else and expect it to, necessarily be able to survive.
And so what's the take-home message off the back of having assembled this? What's the message that I should walk away with?
I think in terms of when we are now thinking about the general interaction of economy and environment, we used to very much think that economics viewed the environment as something to be consumed. Whereas clearly, really, the way we should see it is the economy sits within the broader environment and they are clearly interlinked. And in many ways, our sort of inappropriate or misuse of resources and species in general, and the reasons why we see things being pushed to extinction, is because we've had that almost sort of that consumption perspective on these things, and we can just keep taking as if they're manna from heaven. But clearly, we have to realize we're interlinked. And I think that's probably the big take-home message here, which is, we have to realize that the economy will benefit and we will benefit from having the species and having more species. And at the same time, we as consumers will also benefit from having that sort of underlying biological resilience as well, which is, imperatively important for maintaining the sort of the world and society we want to live in.
Ian Fraser on the economics of extinction and conservation. Well, let's stick with economics, but now let's look at the most abundant chemical on the planet, and that is water and its inequity. Compared with someone in certain third world countries where every drop can count, if you live in a developed nation like the UK, you probably don't even give it a moment's thought when you turn the shower on, fill a bath or wash your car. As the world population rises further though, and climate change limits where we can live and how much water is available to each of us, the price and value of water will matter increasingly to everyone, regardless of where we live. And that means we need to think about the economics of what will become a supply-limited resource, which is what Quentin Grafton has been considering by asking 5 key questions. Why water is, or isn't, priced and valued? What are the key economic concepts behind pricing water? How water supply assets are valued for full cost recovery? Who bears those costs versus who enjoys the benefits? And when will the price of water begin to change?
We need to price water because if it's not priced, there's the tendency to not conserve it, not look after it, use too much. And that's true whether you're a farmer or whether you're a household or an individual. The value is really around the different uses of water, whether it's, for drinking, very high value, or whether it's for the garden, which is less highly valued, so that we know if we have to prioritize water across different alternative and competing uses, we want to make sure it goes to the highest value possible. In places that don't have much water, which is a good part of Australia, the priority always goes to drinking water. And then you set up all your planning, all your water infrastructure to make sure that's where it goes.
So what are the key concepts that economists should use then when trying to come up with a pricing strategy for water?
The issue is really around marginal cost and marginal benefit. Marginal just means some incremental amount of water that's delivered to me as a farmer or to a household. And the cost is, well, how much did we spend and expend to actually get that delivery? So that's marginal cost. And the other concept is this idea of marginal benefit, which is really about what extra we get from consuming water. Marginal benefit and marginal cost, whilst making sure that the essential uses for water are available to everybody.
So how should it be priced then? Because also it's going to really vary according to where you live on Earth, whether you have a too much water problem or a too little water problem, or no money in your pocket, some money in your pocket.
I have lived in a number of cities around the world. So one is Wellington, New Zealand. Now there, in the city of Wellington, you don't pay a volumetric price for water. So what that means is that a lot of people will waste water. And also the suppliers of water in Wellington don't have the incentive to deal with water that gets lost in the pipes that doesn't actually get to the households. Compare it to where I live in Canberra, Australia. We pay very high volumetric prices in Canberra, and that ensures that we have the right signals to look after the water in the sense that we are not going to waste the water.
How does that, though, incentivize the people who are delivering you the water to make sure their pipes aren't leaky? Because I saw a staggering statistic for UK water supplies recently, which suggested that the amount that actually comes out of a tap somewhere is only a fraction of the amount that went in. It's not like losses are a little bit on top. It's like there are losses with a little bit of delivery on top.
But part of the problem is if you're not being paid as the supplier per amount of water of litre that you're selling, so to speak, the incentive to do something about it's just not there. Compare that to Canberra. If you are getting paid per litre, the water supplier in that context has every incentive to deal with those leaks and leaky pipes because they're going to get much higher revenue if they actually deal with them.
Ultimately, it comes down to the who, though, doesn't it? Which is one of your other questions. Who is benefiting or needing the water? And there's the staggering statistic in your review that half the world population are in water crisis at least once a year for a month or so. So how do we sort this one out, given where people are, the massive scale we're dealing with, and the unpredictability with climate change and other things in the sorts of geographies that we're going to have to consider?
Well, it's a water supply issue in some sense. The water needs to be accessible and an affordable price, and that's an infrastructure story. But that story is also not just about pipes. It's also about protecting wetlands. It's about protecting upper catchments, with forests. So you actually maintain quality water in terms of not having sediment in it, for example. And then you also have this whole issue around making sure that, yes, water is affordable, yes, that it's safe, but also that the costs are covered. So we need to deal with that, and that is around pricing, but it's also around water values as well. Key values, and the highest value is really drinking water, and not just for people living in big cities, but also people on the fringes of the urban areas, and also people in rural areas. That's the missing dimension to it.
So is your approach here that when a country is looking to try to improve its water situation, they should be thinking about these economic principles, and then there's a sort of a framework for them to follow, which hitherto it's been very ad hoc geographically?
Exactly right. So, if I were to say the four pillars really in terms of how we should respond to the water crises in the context of water pricing and values, we need to get cost recovery because the person supplying need to get their costs covered. Otherwise, they're not going to supply. So that the price that people are paying is transparent, and it also covers that extra cost to bring it into your household or to your farm. Basic water needs need to be met. And then the last but not least is consumers need to be incentivized. And that's where water prices come in. So they're incentivized to conserve water, not to waste water, not to over extract water. Those are the things that pricing can do. It can be done and it has been done in both rich and poor countries. So we can do this. It's something that we can fix, certainly with an urban context and anywhere in the world. It becomes more challenging in rural areas because it's much more difficult to supply accessible, safe water in the whole parts of the world in remote communities, for example.
Quentin Grafton, he's at the Australian National University in Canberra. Of the billions of tonnes of carbon that we emit annually, a significant proportion ends up ultimately in the sea, where it contributes to so-called blue carbon. This is carbon locked away in marine and coastal ecosystems. By soaking up carbon, they help to mitigate against climate change. But they may themselves fall victim to climate change and one of the other consequences of global warming, and that is sea level rise. The University of Wollongong's Kerry Rogers has been looking at the present, the past and the future of blue carbon.
Blue carbon is the carbon that's sequestered by marine ecosystems. When we use the term sequestered, we're really talking about carbon being trapped for long periods of time. When we're talking about marine ecosystems, we're really talking about mangrove forests and salt marshes and seagrass meadows. They're the biggest blue carbon stores that we have. And actually, mangrove forests are amongst the most efficient ecosystems at sequestering carbon from the atmosphere.
When we're talking about things like mangroves, how long can they lock away carbon for? Is it long times like oil and coal, or is it just a temporary holding measure for carbon?
Probably a bit of all of those things, actually. So there is some carbon that gets pulled into the mangrove woody material, and if a forest drops some leaf litter, that organic material might break down relatively quickly and return back to the atmosphere. Then you've got carbon that is pulled into the root zone. So this is the plants as they photosynthesize, they grab the carbon and they're adding organic mass to the structure of the tree, and some of that is below ground in the roots. And that material can stay for a lot longer because it's below the ground surface, so it doesn't sort of get distributed away on tides like leaf litter might. And it's locked away from exposure to the atmosphere to some degree. And this exposure is partly because those roots are covered up with sediments, but also because tides come in and out relatively regularly. As those tides come in, they actually make the substrates really waterlogged. And for decomposition to occur aerobically, you need air in the substrate. With tides coming in all the time, it stops the availability or limits the amount of air that's available within substrates, and that then slows down the rate of decomposition of that organic material or that root material that's down below the substrate surface.
So it is a legitimate way of locking up carbon for a reasonable length of time.
Yes, in the right circumstances, and the right circumstances don't occur everywhere. What it really requires is that carbon getting locked away for a really long period of time. So it means the sediments can't be eroded. It also means that they need to remain relatively unexposed to the atmosphere and to those to oxygenation. And that only occurs under sort of special circumstances. So it's where tides are coming in and out all the time, and where that rate of inundation actually limits the exposure to oxygen and also slows down another mechanism of decomposition. So when we have tides coming in, they're often salty water, and that salty water slows down another process of decomposition called methanogenesis. This is a process that creates another greenhouse gas, not carbon dioxide, but it creates methane gas. And so that inundation with salty water actually means that those methanogenic processes, those processes that create methane, are also slowed down. So we've got a number of mechanisms that create conditions for decomposition of the organic material from mangroves and salt marshes to be relatively slow.
On the one hand, then, this is a good thing, because as we release more man-made carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we've got somewhere for it to go. On the other hand, presumably, the changes which are happening to temperatures, to sea levels, and so on, could be jeopardising this very thing which is there acting as a sponge to mitigate that.
Yes, yeah. So I guess blue carbon is not a silver bullet. It's not the solution to climate change. And it's not the overwhelming solution for multiple reasons. One of them being, firstly, that the capacity of blue carbon ecosystems to sequester carbon or bring more carbon from the atmosphere is actually limited because of the extent of these systems. We've been cutting down mangrove forests, and urban expansion has occurred across salt marsh flats, and that's slowing down our capacity or limiting the capacity of these ecosystems to pull carbon from the atmosphere. The other issue, as you already touched on, is that these ecosystems are actually at risk from climate change themselves. They occur right near the sea. They're roughly at near mean sea level. And if mean sea level is rising, these ecosystems also have to adapt to that change in mean sea level to survive. We've done some modelling work that actually shows that the capacity of these ecosystems to adjust to sea level rise appears to have an upper threshold limit. And we potentially could be hitting those upper threshold limits before the end of this century.
Kerry Rogers. And that's where we have to leave it for this episode, but for the references and interview transcripts for any of the papers that we've been hearing about in this edition of the programme, please head over to nakedscientist.com/prisms, where you can also find how you can subscribe to this podcast if you don't already. And if you've got some science to publish, why not submit it to the journals today? And maybe you can become our next guest here on the Cambridge Prisms podcast. I'm Chris Smith from The Naked Scientists. Thanks for listening, and until we're next together again, goodbye.